suggestion that we should send military and economic missions to Russia. So, you know, it's from the beginning, they're obviously quite keen to get any help they can.
Absolutely, and they're very keen early on to formalize some sort of relationship. The Soviet Union, and Stalin in particular, is incredibly keen to ensure that some sort of arrangement is made for the Soviet Union to also provide assistance to Britain in some way, in any way that it can. But, you know, ultimately, they're united in their common enemy at this point, and that's where a lot of this comes from.
They call it an era of collaboration.
Absolutely.
And that's straight from the off. It's remarkable. These two powers that were quite hostile to each other only weeks before, suddenly.
Absolutely.
Right, so how does that relationship progress?
So even as early then as the 29th of June, only a few days later, both representatives, the representatives of both sides, are starting to talk about some specifics, particularly from a military point of view. And Russia almost provides a list of requirements militarily.
List, yeah.
It is a shopping list. So, you know, in particular, this relates to aircraft. That's what they're really keen to obtain in some way, whatever that might be.
Because their Air Force was devastated in the opening days of Operation Barbarossa, wasn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, and they're asking for huge numbers here, 3,000 fighter aircraft, 3,000 bombers. You know, these are not small numbers.
That's more than the number of fighter aircraft took part in the Battle of Britain for the RAF. That's a lot.
And also then anti-aircraft guns. They're again being paralysed really by the German Air Force at this stage. So they're again incredibly keen to obtain as well, essentially as much as they possibly can.
Well, I love it. It's like one specimen aircraft, our latest night fighter designed with full war equipment. They want the good stuff, don't they?
They do. They're absolutely
cutting edge technology.
And it's not just then about the military side of things. Raw materials are a massive part of what Britain can contribute to the Soviet Union. So we have here on the 31st of July another communication between Churchill and Stalin, and he starts talking about specifics. So in particular, how Britain might supply rubber to the Soviet Union. The Soviets, Stalin in particular, talks a lot about that, how that is the raw material which they're missing, which they need in large quantities, and Britain is able and happy to provide that as best as they can as well.
Churchill doing the classic power move there. Following my personal intervention, arrangements now complete for the dispatch of 10,000 tons of rubber from this country to one of your northern ports. There we go, there's the Arctic convoys. British ships carrying this rubber and certain other supplies will be loaded within a week. In 10 days, we'll sail to one of your northern ports as soon as the Admiralty can arrange convoy. There we go. There's your Arctic convoy coming in. It's like he's desperately trying to show Stalin that he's doing everything he possibly can. And
realistically, at this point in the war, it's really the limit to what Britain can actually provide from this point of view. Well, there we go. Well, thanks very much, Will. That was fascinating.
These documents chart the first steps towards a plan to supply the Soviet Union with the war material they desperately needed. But exactly how they could do it still needed to be decided.
The obstacles facing Churchill and Stalin were as large as they were obvious. In the summer of 1941, the Axis powers controlled the vast majority of the continent of Europe, basically all the territory between the UK and the Soviet Union. Therefore, no supplies were coming across by land. This also ruled out sending them by air, even if planes had had the heavy lift capability to take the sheer number of supplies needed. There was no way that aircraft would be able to fly across this Axis-dominated airspace without taking ridiculously high losses. That left taking things by ship. Now, there are a few options for that. The first option is leaving the UK, coming down the Atlantic coast of Europe, into the Mediterranean, going via Malta, the Suez Canal, round to the Persian Gulf, up through Iran, overland, through the Caucasus, and into the heart of the Soviet Union. Another way would be to do that route, but go even longer down around the southern tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean, and that way into the Persian Gulf. Option 3, the longest of all, would be to send ships across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, right across the Pacific. This is before the Pacific War is broken out, it's before Pearl Harbor, and to the Asian coast of the Soviet Union, where supplies could then be brought across the Trans-Siberian Railroad to where the supplies were needed, where the fighting was around here. The last option was short and direct. British convoys could go out here into the Arctic Ocean, around the top of occupied Norway, and into the Soviet port of Murmansk, right on the northern tip of the Soviet Union, or the port of Archangel here. Whichever way they chose, they were going to be presented with some serious difficulties.
Churchill quickly became intrigued by the directness of this northern route and tasked his leading naval men, First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound and Commander of the Home Fleet Sir John Tovey, with working out the feasibility of sending British convoys into the Arctic. In mid-July, Rear Admirals Philip Vian and Geoffrey Miles headed to Russia. Their first stop would be Murmansk. They were not impressed.
The port of Murmansk was in a terrible state. It had been pummeled. It was just 10 minutes flying time from the Axis Air Force Base at Samo. The civilian population had been evacuated, the shore facilities had been smashed, there weren't enough cranes, and they weren't heavy enough to deal with the huge volume of supplies that Stalin was demanding. As well as all that, the Finns, fighting alongside the Germans, were trying to push into northern Russia here to seize the rich natural resources. And on top of it all, Murmansk was only connected to the rest of the Soviet Union by this train line that ran down here through Leningrad, which was itself a key target of Operation Barbarossa. The other alternative was the port of Archangel. This had one great advantage. It was further from German bomber bases, so it hadn't been as badly damaged, but its port facility still needed a lot of work if it was going to deal with the amount of supplies that were expected. But there was a key downside. It was 400 miles further by sea than Murmansk. Now that meant 2 extra days for these big old lumbering cargo ships. Now the key disadvantage was that ships had to pass through this very narrow channel into the White Sea. And that was the perfect targeting zone for German planes and U-boats. There was nowhere to hide as they were making that narrow transit. On top of all that, in the winter, the White Sea freezes solid, becomes completely impassable. So you can see why Admiral Pound said the dice were loaded against us in every direction. But Churchill didn't care. Murmansk and Archangel were to be prepared as best they could. The Soviet Union needed help, and the most direct way of doing that was via the Arctic.
It's important to remember that at this stage of the war, Britain was not faring well. She was isolated in Western Europe. Her army had had to beat an undignified retreat from the continent just a year earlier. The Axis powers were also making great strides in the Mediterranean and North Africa. The USA was yet to enter the war officially, and despite Stalin's insistence on the opening of a new front to divert Axis forces away from the Soviet Union, Britain was in no position to launch an assault on Hitler's Festung Europa. It meant a convoy of goods to the USSR was imperative. It ensured the Soviets could continue to fight, but also showed Stalin that the UK was trying to help in whatever way she could, at some cost to herself. There were massive logistical issues associated with the Arctic convoys, and an additional burden placed on the already strained shoulders of the Royal and Merchant Navies. Churchill gave it the green light.
As Churchill put it in one meeting, Russia was a very welcome guest at a very hungry table. Britain was also desperate for resources. It needed to replace all the aircraft it had lost, for example, during the Battle of Britain and other operations. It also had to find replacements for the mountain of vehicles and ammunition that had been abandoned during the retreat from Dunkirk the previous year. The Soviet Union couldn't just be allowed to absorb all Britain's resources. For this to work, for it to be sustainable, Churchill needed to have a chat with Roosevelt.
The American president nations had signed off on the Lend-Lease program in early 1941. It supplied the UK with American-made planes, tanks and other material for war. It helped to bolster the British manufacturing industries, that although doing the best they could, were small and were under constant threat of bombing raids. However, with a new mouth to feed at the table, and one as voracious as the USSR, new quotas would have to be negotiated between the US and the UK to ensure that the new allies on either side of Europe were adequately provisioned. And of course, that the USA was happy with the eventual destination of their goods.
On August the 15th, Churchill and Roosevelt issued a joint statement to Stalin. Here it is. We are at the moment cooperating to provide you with the very maximum of supplies you most urgently need. Already many shiploads have left our shores and more will leave in the immediate future. We realize fully how vitally important to the defeat of Hitlerism is the brave and steadfast resistance of the Soviet Union. And we therefore feel that we must not in any circumstances fail to act quickly and immediately in this matter on planning the program for the future allocation of our joint resources. There was now a supply system in place. It looked like these convoys might actually work.
And so it was, that as that statement of joint cooperation was issued, the first of the Arctic convoys, codenamed Dervish, was steaming for the Russian port of Archangel. It left Liverpool on the 12th of August and was comprised of half a dozen old freighters supported by a handful of escort vessels.
It wasn't perhaps the most impressive sight in the world, but it was the first trickle in what would become a flood of supplies to the Soviet Union during the war. On board were tons of wool, of rubber, of tin, nearly 50 Hurricane aircraft designed to intercept any German bombers that tried to attack the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. And of course, being Churchill, he always had an eye for the propaganda effect of everything, how it would play to the wider world. So on board there were also writers, journalists, and artists to capture the moment.
Northwards to the Arctic Circle rides the convoy and escort bound for ports in northern Russia.
As Churchill had so shrewdly identified, it was the political aspect of the convoys that would have the greatest impact. In the UK, the men and women in factories knew their guns, planes and ammunition might be getting shipped to the Soviet Union to support their new allies in the fight against the enemy, rather than being stockpiled in the UK. It also demonstrated to the Soviets that they were not alone, and together, the UK and the USSR could defeat the Nazis.
To foster closer relations between the two countries, a propaganda campaign was launched right across the UK. And at its heart, obviously, were the Arctic convoys. There were posters like this one showing a valiant British fleet supported in the skies above by Soviet fighters. And then magazines, newspapers were given special access, splashing pictures of the Arctic convoys all across their front pages like this one here. There was even an exhibition curated called Comrades in Arms, pictures of the Soviets at war. And in it there were various images of Soviet service personnel in their hour of need, and a big image of Churchill and Stalin as brothers in arms.
Despite the skepticism surrounding the convoy, Dervish made it to Archangel on the 31st of August 1941, fully intact. The success of Dervish spurred on the Navy to continue this convoy route. In the last months of 1941, a further 9 convoys, now codenamed PQ after the man in charge of the early planning, PQ Edwards, departed the UK, bound for the USSR. By the end of the year, 250,000 tons of supplies had reached Russia. Of the 57 supply ships that had been sent eastbound, only 1 had been lost. It was a huge boost to the fledgling UK-USSR alliance. But as 1941 turned to 1942, the sailing of the Arctic convoys wouldn't be quite as smooth. I'm meeting with naval historian and curator at the Imperial War Museum, Rob Rumble, who can tell me a bit more about the convoy system and the particular threats that face ships on the Murmansk run.
Well, Rob, we come to the right place to talk about the Arctic convoys. Here we are on a mess deck of HMS Belfast. She was at the heart of it.
Yes, HMS Belfast was one of the most famous Royal Navy warships from the Arctic convoys. Recommissioned in December 1942, Belfast sailed to the Arctic from January 43 up until April 1944. In fact, she sailed 12 operations across the Arctic Circle during that period.
So we're down here where the crew would have slept and eaten, and I can imagine them huddling down here for warmth.
Yes, at least down here in the mess deck, they would have been sheltered from the horrendous Arctic weather on deck. These mess decks would have been warmed by steam pipes to at least provide the sailors with a small amount of comfort whilst off duty.
But once they climb up these ladders, they are in some of the most harshest conditions that war had ever been fought in.
The conditions during the Arctic convoys were horrendous. Up to minus 30 degrees Celsius in temperature, towering seas, gale force 10 winds and 50-foot waves, constant darkness and freezing snow, some of the harshest conditions any sailors would face during the Second World War.
So let's talk about the word convoy. It's very familiar to people, but let's sort of demonstrate what it actually means. We've got all our exciting models here. What is the idea behind gathering ships together in convoy?
Well, at first it would seem counterintuitive to have all of your ships in one place where the enemy could attack them all in one go. But the convoy system was remarkably successful. How it worked is a convoy of 20 to 50 merchant ships.
So these little ones can be merchant ships, even though it's not appropriate because they're warships. But now they're not armed, aren't they? They've got no particular weaponry.
Not much. They're very slow, or relatively slow, only sailing at about 8 to 10 knots, which is about 9 to 11 miles per hour, filled to the hold with supplies for the Soviet war effort. So tanks, aircraft, machine parts, ammunition, even railway locomotives chained to the decks. When they were together in formation in convoy, that meant you could have an escort screen of warships in close proximity to the convoy at all times. Now, these escort ships, destroyers, corvettes and the like, would have been armed with 4-inch guns, 4 inches being the diameter of the gun barrel bore, depth charges, anti-aircraft guns, and by the time of the Arctic convoys were equipped with ASDIC, which is better known as sonar today, to detect enemy submarines.
So we've got these anachronistic aircraft here, so please don't send any letters to us. But so enemies would have tried to use air and surface ships, E-boats, small and bigger surface ships, and then submarines. We don't have any submarines, but let's use one of these little things here. So all different ways of attacking this convoy.
Indeed, and it was the job of the escort vessels to detect the enemy and to then engage them before they could launch attacks on the merchant ships.
So you mentioned the Germans here trying to interdict this flow of supplies. How seriously did they take it? Well, how much of an effort was it for them?
Well, at first, the Arctic convoys were relatively small in number, but they soon increased in frequency. By September 1941, Hitler himself was concerned about the flow of supplies from the Western Allies to the Soviet Union, and he issued Führer Order 36, ordering German armed forces within Scandinavia to focus on attacking the Arctic convoys as they sailed around the Norwegian coast.
The interesting about these Arctic convoys is even more than the convoys going back and forth across the Atlantic to Canada and the US. You're passing a lot of enemy-held territory. The geography is not good, is it?
No, the Germans at this stage of the war occupied the Norwegian coast, and from major bases such as Alpenfjord, the German surface fleet could sally forth and cause significant damage to the convoys. But similar to the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat threat was the most serious to the convoys. U-boats sailing from the Norwegian coast could lie in wait and torpedo any unsuspecting merchant ships, it's worth remembering that because of the horrendous weather, there was always a danger of convoys being broken up in the darkness and in the storms. So the U-boat threat was a very serious one.
So we've got these convoys, particularly in the winter. Presumably, there's pack ice. It's not just terrible weather and snow. I mean, it's actual. Can they always get through to Murmansk?
Well, Murmansk was the only Russian port to be open and free of ice all year due to the Atlantic drift currents, which kept the ice at bay. But you're right, further north, there was pack ice completely blocking access to the seas north of the Norwegian coast. So the convoys had to sail much further south than comfortable to be free from the ice. However, that meant that they were in closer range to German forces sailing or flying out of Norway. As the Arctic winter led into spring, the ice started to break up. So another hazard that the ships had to deal with were icebergs. And there are accounts of sailors sleeping in messes within the forward sections of their ships, being kept awake by the thud of icebergs as the ship sailed through them.
Banging on the hull.
That's it exactly, yes.
Crikey. And what was the effect on Belfast and these other ships? Was that environment really, really difficult? And did Belfast have to go in for regular refits?
Yes, the biggest problem they had was ice forming on the superstructure and on the mechanisms. If you imagine the spray of the water hitting the freezing steel of the ships, gun turrets froze up, gun barrels froze up, and the crew during the short Arctic day were all employed on trying to break off the ice. Regular refits were required, but these weren't always possible sailing between Britain and Soviet Russia. So when Belfast was taken off the Arctic convoys from April 1944 onwards, she received a welcome refit ready for further operations in the war.
I mean, her crew must have been quite happy to have stopped doing that.
Yes, the shore leave afforded when Belfast went back into refit was most welcome. Belfast was refitted at Rosyth in Scotland, so shore leave to Edinburgh was very popular with the crew to finally see their families and go and see a film or a show.
And maybe go to the pub.
I think many of them stayed there for most of their leave, yes.
For the rest of the war, these Arctic convoys kept plying the northern route, departing from Liverpool, the Clyde, and Loch Ewe. But it wasn't just the men on the ships who made these convoys possible. Hundreds of British specialists were sent to Murmansk and Archangel in order to get the port facilities ready to accept the volume of supplies needed. Meanwhile, the Soviet defenders of Murmansk and the areas surrounding fought a brilliant and desperate defense in spite of the overwhelming odds against them. They kept the city free and allowed the port to be used.
Over the course of the war, nearly 4 million tons of supplies was delivered to the Soviet Union via the Arctic route. It was a phenomenal amount. What's all too often forgotten are the stories of the men who had to take it there. The men who had to go on what Winston Churchill described as the worst journey in the world.
I'm joining Captain David Parsons of the Merchant Navy Association, who can tell me more about the men who lived and died on these convoys.
So David, who were these men?
They were civilians, as simple as that. Many of them had been at sea all their lives. A lot of them had been through the 1930s recession. So they were actually glad to have permanent employment.
But they hadn't signed up to...
But they hadn't signed up for the Russian convoys. And I think a lot of them were unaware of how brutal war was going to become anyway, in a more general sense. Their ages ranged between 14 and 70 plus. Those at 70 plus, quite a lot of those came back to sea from retirement. So, you know, by that time they were elderly people, but wanted to do their bit because they had the experience and the skills for their country.
Huge variety in age.
Absolutely.
Huge social mix.
Huge social mix, yes. I mean, you know, officers, crew, some of the crew came from obviously very poor backgrounds. Many of them came from overseas as well. We had, in those days, we had a lot of Alaskans, Chinese, and African crews. So they were primarily ratings, but there was also a lot of British ratings as well.
What conditions did they face?
Pretty basic on a lot of cases. I mean, though most of the ships that were on those convoys were not designed to be in Arctic waters. So some were cargo liners, which have been on the traditional trades between mostly our country and the Commonwealth. Some were tramps, which could go anywhere. The crew, the seamen themselves, could live in the forecastle, which is the fore part of the ship, or the after part of the ship, depending on who they were, in very, very basic accommodation, 6 or more in a cabin, very rudimentary heating. They had straw mattresses, affectionately known as donkey's breakfasts. They were issued with one of those at the beginning of every trip, and 2 blankets. And when they were on the Arctic convoys, they just never got undressed. 2 reasons. One, to try and keep warm. The other, if they had to abandon ship, at least, you know, they had some warm clothes to do so.
And you've talked to so many of these veterans. What are their memories and stories about being in those northern latitude waters?
Well, the very positive side of it, and it was always true of the Merchant Navy, was a camaraderie. Ships are like a little community, and you normally sail with really good people that you become very close friends with and never see again when you leave the ship. And that was the main thing. That's what kept them going. But I think it was also a terrifying experience. I mean, they were in freezing cold waters. Their biggest worry was if they had to abandon ship, if they went into the water, they would have a few minutes to survive at best.
Do you think the Arctic convoys was the worst posting, the worst job they had to do?
I think it probably was. I think it probably was. I mean, none of them signed up to do that. They didn't know where the ships were going. Nobody told the crew where the ship was going until it sailed. They may have an idea when they saw what the cargo was, but they didn't know. And of course, when they got there, it was horrendous. I mean, they had open bridges. A lot of the lookout posts were open. They were out there in all weathers. They frequently had to turn to knock ice off deck machinery and deck housing.
Are there any names up here on these memorials that you are particularly drawn to?
There are. I'll point out 2, if I may, on this one here.
All right, David, which one are we looking at here?
So we're looking at the Gulistan, out of Newcastle on Tyne,
Yeah.
almost certainly a tramp. She was lost with all 51 hands,
Right.
just off Spitsbergen.
So deep into the Arctic.
Deep into the Arctic, yeah. The master's name at the top of the list, at the very bottom of the list, only in alphabetical order, is Peter Wilson. He was 16.
Wow.
Kind of brings it home.
So we can imagine the last few minutes of that ship in the Arctic, freezing cold, November, dark.
Yeah, probably some got off, but didn't survive. It's awful. November in those waters.
You're caught between the devil and deep blue sea. It's either the heat of the fire,
Yes.
of the scalding steam coming from
Yes.
rupturing pipes, or you're into the freezing cold.
Yeah.
It's a vision of hell, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is. It is. Kind of brings it home. They'd still been at school now.
The brutal Arctic route claimed the lives of an estimated 3,000 sailors, including 16-year-old Peter Wilson. The Soviet ambassador in London, Ivan Maysky, said the Arctic convoys were a northern saga of heroism, bravery, and endurance, one of the most striking expressions of collaboration between Allied governments, without which our common victory would have been impossible. This is the Soviet War Memorial in South London. It's the only one in the UK. The inscription reads, Veshnaya Vam Pamyat, eternal memory to you.
The Arctic convoys were a remarkable feat. They helped sustain the Soviet war effort. They eroded Axis resources, and in the end, they contributed to Allied victory in the war. It's worth remembering that all of these war materials that were delivered to the Soviet Union went to arm and equip millions of young Soviets as they fought against Hitler's forces and sustained terrible casualties. Although the tanks and guns and aircraft cost Britain and America a lot of money, as one Soviet Red Army veteran, Viktor Kravchenko, said, God knows we paid it back in full in Russian lives.
Well, guys, did you enjoy the movie? John, take a place. How old are you? She's 16.
16.
Yes.
See, so you could have been serving, men could have been serving on those convoys.
I will stay in the standing position. So now we have time for questions from people, and I also have some questions from people who connected online. So the first question is, what advice could you give to the younger generation connected with our previous historic experience?
That's a rather a big question. Where's Anastasia? What advice can I give? Well, I'd say, firstly, if you have the chance, join the Navy, obviously. I'm not sure how good is your English here. Jak wasz angielski język? So, чуть-чуть? Неплохо. So I would say I joined the Navy, the Royal Navy, when I was 19. So я вступил во флот, когда мне было 19 лет. So, может, почти 40 лет назад. So my one advice would be is follow your dreams. So you're 16, 17, you're learning English, you изучаете английский язык. You have all the possibilities in the world, so I'd say that if you know what you want to do, если вы знаете, что вы хотите делать в будущем, do it, делайте. No, follow your dreams. And work hard, because that's the second piece of advice I'd give, is that there is no such thing, as we say in English, as a free lunch. So bezplatny obiad nie существует, как мы говорим по-английски. So the effort you put in now will pay you rewards in the future. No effort, no reward. So that was two pieces of advice I'd give to you youngsters. And thirdly, if you feel like it, serving your country in the armed forces is a noble act, as we saw in the film.
Thank you. Any other questions, guys? Please.
What do you think is the most useful product that the convoys delivered?
That's a good question. I think, obviously, 16 million tons of aid lend-leased, 4 million tons of aid by the convoys. I think it changed over time. So I was in St. Petersburg a year, 2 years ago, and I went to the Museum of the Siege, the blockade. And January 1941, obviously the city is under siege. So they needed bandages, they needed warm clothing, they needed boots, food, rations, those sort of things to stop the Germans capturing the city in 1941. Bandages, medical equipment. Obviously, as the Germans were stopped by the Red Army in 1942, the Red Army went from defensive to offensive. So therefore, then it needed trucks, train tracks, machine goods, aircraft, bombs. So I think it changed as the war went on. Any more?
Any other questions, guys?
What do you think about modern types of army and weapons? And I'm not talking about physical weapon, I'm talking about biological weapon, because it's pretty dangerous, and I think that everyone will be able to receive a professional side from the great person like you.
I would say, well, obviously, chemical and biological weapons are banned by a UN convention. So I think what's interesting at the moment is the pace of change. I've been in the Navy 40 years. The biggest change in the last 40 years has been the power of computing and the application of computing power to warfare. So smart weapons, smart bombs, but also now, I'm not sure what subjects you're studying, things like exclusive intellect, artificial intelligence, machine learning, those sort of things, which are making our weapons more and more efficient. Plus the ability to detect and to see long distances to process huge amounts of data and information. So I would say that's been the biggest change I've seen.
Any other questions?
Ask me anything. The one there. Like Reddit.
So, as a military person, I think you, of course, learn the history of the Second World War, and I have only one question. What lesson you must understand from the war? What the most terrible effect or the event from the Second World War?
Second World War. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy has been around for 1,000 years. So our history is a whole millennia. The biggest lesson to learn for the Second World War is not to have a war. I mean, we suffered terribly in the First World War, which was a trauma for our country, which is still going on. So that cost us 1.5 million dead, World War I. World War II cost the Soviet Union 27 million dead, 100 million dead worldwide. So 100 million. So any Third World War, 1 billion dead, because we've now got nuclear weapons. So I would say the biggest lesson is not to go to war in the first place. I think another lesson I'll take away is cooperation. You know, the foundations of the modern order, the United Nations, comes from the Allies in Second World War. The UK, US, America, UK, US, France, Soviet Union, and then China later on. So it showed that, you know, to defeat fascism, which is, you know, absolute evil, we came together to work in a common cause, and I think that is the excellent lesson for us all. Today, we have serious challenges. I mentioned climate change. Your generation is going to be confronted with climate change. How are we going to deal with that? We're not going to deal with it individually. We can deal with it together.
Well, any other questions? No questions?
No. The young chap there.
Do you think other trade routes could become more successful?
Może powtórzyć? Sorry.
Do you think other trade routes could become more successful?
Как по-русски?
Как вы думаете, могли бы существовать более успешные торговые?
Trade routes.
Да.
Oh, okay. Well, of course, the big question at the moment is about the Northern Sea route, isn't it? So, you know, at the moment, our goods come from China, across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, to Europe, that way. And we live on an island, so our our whole life is to do with trade, open seas, freedom of navigation. I think there's talk about the Northern Sea Route, which is across the top of Russia. But as we saw in the film, the conditions in the north, in the Arctic, are not very good. So I know that the Russian government wants to quadruple the amount of trade along the top of Russia over the next 15 years. So maybe it will shorten the route, the time from China to Europe by maybe 2 weeks. So that's good. Cost, cost savings. On the other hand, what about the ice? What about the conditions? What about? So I would say that that is probably the unknown. I mean, global warming makes it easier to use, but also makes it dangerous at the same time. So that's what I'd say. Or maybe the new Silk Road across land.
Any other questions, guys? Leo, please.
What do you think about the modern process of globalization? Because it's a pretty sensitive topic right now.
Globalization. Hey, I'm a Navy guy. I'm in the Royal Navy. I mean, I could give you a long essay about globalization. I think what's interesting at the moment is in the UK, the discussion about globalization is that what we've done is we've basically shifted productivity to other countries. So it affects people from our own country. It's all good, well, to have stuff built in China and brought by ship to UK. What about young British people? What about their futures? What about their prospects? I think the same is to a degree in Russia. What about the prospects of the young people in this audience here? It's all great to have your computers to come from China, Japan, whatever, but what about your own high-tech industry? What about your own investment? What about your industrial base? So I would say there's that rebalancing after the pandemic, and what jobs do you bring home and what jobs do you have abroad?
Well, any other questions, guys? Please raise your hands. Nikita, please.
Thanks. What other countries helped with Lend-Lease besides the USA and UK?
Well, mostly it came from America. When America entered the war, Churchill apparently wept. He cried. He was so happy because the American economy is absolutely enormous, and it was shifted from being peacetime to wartime economy. So almost all the goods came from America. And Stalin said in 1943 that the Second World War would be won British brains, American steel, and Russian blood. And I think that was right. America was producing thousands of aircraft a week, just huge numbers of vehicles. I know the figures they gave to the Soviet Union, thousands of vehicles just rolling off the big factories like Ford, General Motors were being shipped onto ships sent to the Soviet Union, firstly by convoys and also by Iran and Far East. So yeah, we have to thank the Americans because it also helped us as well, because as you said, we'd lost most of our army in France in 1940. And then after the war, the Americans then basically rebuilt Europe as well. So, they won the war.
Well, any further questions?
Nowadays, I've noticed a variety of high developing problems from the different spheres of social sphere. What do you think about the new international problems from the entire world? I'm talking about economical, cultural, and social problems from the pandemic.
I don't think I'm gonna broadly discuss the problems. I think it's interesting how, on the pandemic, for me, it's interesting how all the assumptions, our normal assumptions of our life, have been stopped. Trade, travel, how we interact with each other. I think there's been a recognition. I think that we've been underprepared for pandemics. It's a new security threat which we didn't really think about. And we've had bird flu, we've had avian flu, we've had Ebola, We've now got, COVID, what next? And each one of them seems to, the amount of money we've spent collectively on COVID has been astronomical. So I think, I can talk about other causes of whatever. I think global warming for me and mass pandemics threaten to wipe out our not just countries but our civilization, and I think we need to do much better at dealing with them together.
Well,
do you think Lend-Lease played a critical role in the Soviet military effort?
That's a good question. I think it's easy for us to say that Lend-Lease helped win the war, but I think as it says there, we still need soldiers willing and civilians willing to fight the Germans. So without the willingness and the bravery and the commitment, the courage, sacrifice of the Soviet people, to be honest, we could have given 10 times more aid, it wouldn't have worked. So it came down to the fact that we were helping the Soviets continue the fight against the Germans, but ultimately it was because of the Soviet people to continue the fight in 1941 when they could have surrendered, which helped win the war.
Any further questions? Leo was the first.
Well, I think he's had plenty.
Well, I've noticed an interesting phenomenon that now one of the most important and, of course, developing spheres is an academic sphere. What do you think about this sphere at all? Is it reliable within different kinds of society? I'm talking about this current development.
With space? Yeah, well, I can give you the political response is that, we're keen that space remains demilitarized. Unfortunately, as you have seen, Russia conducted an anti-satellite test 2 weeks ago, which jeopardized commercial use of space and human use of space. There are discussions in the United Nations to conclude an agreement to make sure that space remains demilitarized. I think that the amount of our lives which are based on use of space now, that strikes me as sensible. But we have concerns that there are efforts both in Russia and China to militarize space, which will need countermeasures.
Well,
have there been supply problems, signs like during the war with Japan or after Pearl Harbor? Have been any problems with Lend-Lease to UK?
Yeah, I think, as it said in the film, we were alone against Germany between the fall of France in May 1940 and the Soviet Union entering the war in June 1941. So that's what I do my maths here. Was that a year? It's just over a year, yeah. And at that time, we were bombed extremely heavily. So my mother was born during the Blitz, the bombing of London. So it was an extremely difficult time for us. The good thing was that we still had a big empire at the time. So a lot of the goods we needed were coming into England from, when was the fall of Pearl Harbor, 741, Japan enters the war. But fortunately, from South America, Africa, and Australia, India, we were able to get the supplies. That's what kept us going. West Indies, America, Canada. Without those links, we would have probably gone under in 1940. So it shows that I'm a Navy guy. We've always had a big Navy because our lifeline is on the sea. And if the Germans tried to starve us in World War I, they tried the same thing again in World War II, and they didn't succeed, but it was extremely close, and we came within weeks of starving in 1942-43. So yeah, is that answered your question?
Any other questions? Leo, please.
Anybody from the back seat over here? Stand up.
I would like to ask you about the modern system of family in UK. What do you think about that? Because I think that everyone will be able to take their own and a unique point or repercussion from the Second World too.
Families. Family system of.
Could you repeat, please?
What do you think about family orienteers in UK?
Family values.
Values. I don't want to get into family values today. I mean, I'm a guy in the uniform. You know, I don't want to be banging on about what people's family values should be. I think, you know, I think one thing I would say though is that the pandemic has shown it's been bad for everybody, but it has been good in lots of ways. How people last year, especially during the lockdown, people came together. Do you understand? So whenever it was locked, I'm not sure we had a lockdown here. We had lockdown in Moscow last year, didn't we? So April, May last year, we all sat in our flats. We couldn't work. But you know, our lockdown in England was longer. And there was a great feel sort of community spirit, which going back to the war was sort of people said this is how Britain had reacted during the war. That's the sort of values we needed to address COVID, you know, staying at home, following the rules, volunteering to help other people, protecting other people as well. So yeah, I would say that's what I'll say about values. Family values, very touchy subject in England for officials to talk about. Okay. Any last ones? So what are you studying? What are you all studying? Kakia.
John also have questions.
Yeah, I have a question. What are they studying?
Oh, we have here students from different departments.
Okay, which departments?
But the majority of them are studying law.
Law.
And some students here are studying also advertising.
Okay.
And that is more. And some most probably study also journalism.
Is that right? Yeah. And how good is your English so far? The English.
In the majority of cases, they're simply shy, but they really study English and they use authentic British and American sources.
Good, good. I mean, I came here first in 1979, 1991, 2007, and then now. And I've noticed how much better the English language is here.
My God.
I mean, much, much better. Even the last 10 to 15 years. I know you can use YouTube and you can watch, you know, Netflix and Disney Plus, whatever. It's all streaming. But I asked one girl, I said, where do you learn your English? And she said, YouTube.
Actually, we have seminars with American fellows twice a month. Mm-hmm. And from the next semester, we'll have them 4 times a month. And some of the students here are involved in a joint program. Mm-hmm. So they're going to get not only Russian diploma, but also an American one from Key West University with 2 students. Excellent. And also the third one who is missed now. Okay. Most probably he went to some duties. Mm-hmm. And so they are also studying subjects in English. Well, and they're finishing the time management course of the next week.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to point this out here that, you know, there is obviously opportunity to study English online, but there's also the opportunity to study in the future